Okay. Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. So I mentioned in the last video that I'm going to be changing up my process for choosing where to go next in my reading. And mostly I'm doing this because, well, for two reasons. For one thing, I don't want to get stuck in a rut. I don't want to read the same thing again and again. But secondly, um, I want to get as many types of voices as I can and as many subjects as I can in my reading and therefore onto this channel because I think that there's value in so many different types of books. Um, and also because on a personal note, whenever I finish a book, it takes me days to figure out what to read next because like I have so many books that I want to get to and so many that I want to reread that I can just go back and forth just having internal debates forever on, where to go next. And I don't want to do that. I want to be a little bit more decisive. And I think having this kind of randomizer to choose my next book is going to help me with that quite a bit. So this kind of leads to an issue though, because a lot of the books that I have, and therefore a lot of the books that I'm going to read, are what you might call problematic. In some cases, their authors are outspoken racists, like H.P. Lovecraft, for example, who, far from being simply a product of his time, was so outspoken in his racism and so severe in his racism that even his friends in the 1920s commented on it in their letters to him. So we know that it was extreme and it heavily impacted his writing. In some cases, they are domestic abusers or other kinds of violent criminals. Uh, in one case, I actually do have a book on my book list by the Marquis de Sade, and that's a scary guy, as you might expect, just from the name. But in some cases, they were outspoken in support of colonialism. For example, Rudyard Kipling, or some people that I've already mentioned. Let's see, where was it? Uh, hmm? Oh, I must not have put it away. Anyway, the Malay Archipelago by Alfred Russel Wallace was by a British naturalist working in Southeast Asia, and he spends large portions of that book lauding the Dutch colonial system and propping it up as a model for the British colonial system. And of course, that's abhorrent. That's terrible. Um, in some cases, things get even worse. In some people that we might be reading are apologists for fascists, like Ezra Pound. Others, well, you know, one of my recent videos was about, yeah, one of my recent videos was about this book, Some Short Stories from Mongolia, which is explicitly communist propaganda. So, and while I do have some sympathies for example, Marx and Engels, I have no sympathy whatsoever for Soviet style, or in this case, Soviet satellite style communism and authoritarianism in general. So the reason I'm making this video is because I want to make it very, very clear that I do not believe that reading books by problematic authors involves endorsing those authors. And more to the point, I do not believe that reading books, even foundational books on an ideology, mean endorsing that ideology. Um, I think that hearing someone else's voice is inherently valuable, even if that voice is terrible. Now, of course, there are limits to that. I'm not going to be reading Mein Kampf. I do not have anything like that on my bookshelf, and I do not intend to, because I don't think that those ideas have any value whatsoever. However, uh, if you, in your own personal reading, think that there is some value in knowing what was going on in that person's mind, in Hitler's mind, That's not necessarily an endorsement of Hitler either. Historians of World War II, historians of Germany in the 20th century probably need to be familiar with that book, and I fully understand that. Um, and going back in the other direction as well, if you if you have family that were lost in the Holocaust, and you think that reading someone like Ezra Pound is just beyond the pale, I respect that as well, because at the end of the day, this is a personal choice. At the end of the day, this is where you put your limits, where you put your reading limits, and everyone will have a different answer for that. And I totally respect that. So I want to talk a little bit about where my limits are, both in terms of reading and in terms of supporting the authors, because I think that these are two separate but related ideas that need to be addressed when talking about problematic authors. So let's talk about two books that both of which are in my ebook folder, which it's a lot. There are a lot of books in my ebook folder, many of which I've read, many of which I have not read. These are two books that I have not read, and they kind of illustrate an important point for me. So one of them is Ender's Game, which I downloaded this illegally. I have to tell you that right away. Because I do not want to give any money to Orson Scott Card because of the ideology he supports and the homophobia that he has taken it upon himself to promote in his work. Now, does that appear in Ender's Game? I don't know. From what I've heard, not really. But it's possible that it might sneak in. But regardless of whether it appears in the work itself, I don't want to support the author. I don't want the author having any of my money. So if I do read that book, it will be illegally downloaded PDF. I'm not going to give him any of my money. Um, Now, I know there are some people out there who are dead set against piracy. I think internet piracy can be a great thing, especially as regards to things like this, where there may be value in a work, but you don't want to support the author of that work. The other book I want to talk about is The Mists of Avalon, which I'm drawing a blank right now on the author, but the author and her husband were credibly accused of decades of sexual abuse of their children. And the difference here is that the author and her husband are both dead. They will see none of the benefits whatsoever. Uh, I happen to have illegally downloaded that book as well, but I would not necessarily have a problem with buying a new copy of that book because I would not be financially supporting someone that I think does not deserve my financial support. So that I think is a really key point here, is that if if an author is irredeemable, I'm not going to give them my money. If they have a disagreement with me, if they have a difference of opinion with me, but I think that they have the potential to grow, or I think that their difference of opinion does not rise to the level of irredeemable, I might give them my money. If they're dead, it doesn't matter. That's my opinion on financially supporting the authors. Now, as far as reading the books, I think that there are a few things to keep in mind. One of which is how much does their action or their words affect the actual book? Because I do think that once those once those words are down on a page, anything the author does later is irrelevant. You know, and this is true not just for literature, by the way. This is true for me for things like music, film, television, whatever. So you know, to use To use a less politically loaded example, um, nothing that nothing that George Lucas did to the Star Wars movies in the 1990s affects the original 1970s and 80s films, because he can add that in, he can edit that in, but the original is still there, and the original is what matters to me, at least. Now, if you like the re-releases with all of the extra bells and whistles, that's great. That's yours. That they're yours. But having the text as set down is important for me, and I think that, like I said, nothing that the author does or says later in their life will change the original text. And I think that that's a key thing to remember, especially when you're deciding whether or not to read a book by someone who, like, for example, J.K. Rowling, who recently said some transphobic things on Twitter. As far as I'm concerned, her transphobic comments on Twitter, they might make her a bad person, but they don't change a word of the Harry Potter novels. So if you love Harry Potter, you can still love Harry Potter. You don't have to endorse everything J.K. Rowling says for the rest of her life to still like her books. That said, there are certainly some authors whose abhorrent ideologies or abhorrent thoughts, abhorrent ideas genuinely do have an impact on their texts, on their books. Um, and for those authors, the question then comes down to where is the line that you want to draw? Um, you know, does it bother me that H.P. Lovecraft's entire oeuvre is essentially a thinly veiled dissertation on why he's afraid of racial mixing? Yeah, it bothers me a lot. Does it bother me that he actually named the cat in one of his most well-known stories with the N word? Yeah, it bothers me a lot. Will I still read H.P. Lovecraft from time to time? Yeah, because although his racism and his fear of women, his xenophobia, his anti-Semitism comes out in his books, the writing is still good enough. The stories are still interesting enough. The ideas outside of those ideas are still interesting enough, and the importance in history is still there enough that there's still value in the book. Uh, Ezra Pound, am I going to read Ezra Pound, even though I know that he was a Nazi sympathizer and a supporter of Mussolini? Yeah, because I like his poetry. That's all. Um, and I think that, well, that's really all I can say. But there are limits. I'm not going to be reading an actual Nazi. I'm not going to be reading books that are just about far right racist movements. Um, Now, I might be reading a few books that are about things that I find abhorrent from the perspective of people that I find abhorrent. For example, I think that it's very interesting to me that the second best-selling book of all time after the Bible is quotations from Chairman Mao Zedong. Do I support Mao? No, not at all. Um, I think Mao is one of history's greatest monsters. Uh, but his ideas are the basis for modern China. And I think if you want to understand modern China, having at least a general grasp on his ideas is important. Uh, and more than that, Mao was actually an interesting writer at times. He maybe not so much in his political philosophy, but believe it or not, Mao was also a poet, and some of his poetry is not so bad. Um, that does not mean I endorse him. That does not mean I support him. It just means that I think that his texts do have value in and of themselves as texts, and that they have value from a historical perspective. Um, I think a lot of a lot of ink has been spilled about well, if you go back to the West, if you go back to Europe and America, a lot of ink was spilled in the 1800s and earlier in support of manifest destiny in the United States, colonialism around the world, slavery in the U.S. and the rest of the Americas, and many of those works were, while they were supporting these terrible things, they were also works of genius. They were also works of brilliance that should not be thrown to the wayside. What we should do instead is bring other voices to the table to counteract them. So I think that, you know, we can read Gone with the Wind, although I haven't read Gone with the Wind yet, to be perfectly honest with you. We can read Gone with the Wind, but we can also read Sojourner Truth. Um, and I know that they're different because Sojourner Truth was writing her own life, whereas Gone with the Wind was a work of fiction. But the point is that uh, we we should not throw out the texts. Instead, we should just read more texts and more varied text and more diverse texts. And that's a key point. When people say they want to get rid of the Western canon, most of the time, 99.99999 recurring percent of the time, they're not saying throw the books out, never read them again. No one believes that. What they are saying is that we can add to that canon. We can uh, we can read newer voices. We can read women's voices. We can read non-white, non-Western voices, and that will add to our understanding of humanity. It will add to our understanding of the world, and that's what I want to do. That's why I made this channel, because, well, actually, the reason I made this channel is that I was reading a book by a Peruvian author, Jose Maria Arguedas. If you've been watching this channel, you probably already watched that video. That was my first full book review video, and just on a whim, out of curiosity, I searched for his name on YouTube, and I found nothing in English, and that's what I want to change. I'm quite frankly not doing a very good job of changing it because ultimately this channel is just a small personal channel. It's my hobby, but I want us to talk more about this kind of topic. I want people to discuss books that are outside of their experience, and I hope that they will. And that's part of the reason why I'm shifting my approach today. And it's part of the reason why I've approached the books that I have so far on the video or in my videos. And it's also part of the reason why I am willing to read these problematic authors, because although the authors may be controversial, although there may be problems with them, that does not mean we should throw out their text. That does not mean we should ignore everything they've ever said. So I hope that kind of explains where I'm coming from with this. And I hope to continue providing glimpses at some very, well, some diverse and maybe unusual books in the future. And I hope you guys can continue watching, those few who are. And I hope more people will watch in the future too. So thank you for coming. See you next time. Have a good day.